Hey there. We at the OER Project are very proud to bring you a virtual conference for social studies teachers everywhere. But we would be lying if we said we didn't miss the real thing. You probably miss it too. At a real conference, you actually get to see your community in person. Plus, there's often mini muffins, which we love. But those organizations that rely on conference fees for all the amazing work they do all year, they need your help right now. So please, I'm talking about the NCSS, the local state council on social studies, and the World History Association. All of them have websites that you can go to and you can join, or you can renew your membership or donate money. Please keep this community strong. And when it's safe, we will see you at the next conference.
Hi, everyone. We hope you're enjoying the second day of the OER Conference for Social Studies so far, and we're thrilled to have you join us for our live discussion on assessing historical thinking. Assessing student historical thinking skills is a worthwhile and incredibly useful practice in the social studies classroom. But how can we assess our own teaching practices and know that we've truly helped students think like historians? What makes history usable to our students? I'm honored to introduce our two live discussion participants today who will tackle these important questions and more, Bob Bain and Nick Dennis. Bob Bain is Associate Professor at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, with joint appointments in the Department of Educational Studies and the Department of History. Trained as a historian, his studies have included investigations of history, teaching and learning in schools and museums, the growth of teacher knowledge, the design and use of history-specific technology, and of the structure and redesign of teacher preparation. Bob has worked on the two OER project courses, Big History Project and World History Project, for 11 years. In conversation with Bob, we are also joined by Nick Dennis. Nick teaches history and politics in a school just outside London, England. He is also a fellow of the School's History Project, England's premier think tank on historical education, and is a co-presenter for a collection of World History Project videos. He has also published a number of resources and articles on diversity in schools, pedagogy, leadership, and historical education. Nick and Bob, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation on assessment. Bob, I'll turn it over to you to kick things off.
Great. Thanks very much, Maheen. And actually, let me start before Nick, you and I jump into this. I want to start by doing some thanks. So I want to thank, of course, Maheen and Chelsea Katzenberg, Jay Hines, Trevor Getz, Bridget O'Connor, Ben and Sherry, Bob Regan, all the teacher leaders in the OER project. And then, of course, NCSS and the World History Association and the professional organizations. I've been in and out of this conference. It's just been terrific. And the one shame, Nick, for us participating in this conversation is we're not going to be able to see all the conversations or the discussion sections. I do want to make one other thanks, and that is, if I were teaching this, I'd be forcing everyone to make certain they looked at the track talks in this session, that they did their homework. And so Joe Adranga, David Sharon, Natalie Mendoza Gutierrez, Terrence Beck, Kim Cutts Elliott, and Leah Marquez, Pete Lepre, and of course, Nick Dennis. All of these track talks were terrific, and we're going to be referencing them as we go through this. And Nick, thanks for you joining this. We're interrupting your dinner, I suspect. And so we appreciate it. And thanks to your family for letting you leave the dinner table to come talk with us. Nick, I want to start with something that Maheen referenced, and that is the school's history project. And you're fellows at the school's history project. I don't know how many American teachers would know about this project and what role it played in not only the history of history education in the UK, but how much it influenced American researchers on it. So can you introduce us a little bit to the school history project?
Yeah, and before I do that, just thanks again to everyone. Bob named everybody. It's been an amazing experience, and I know people have really enjoyed watching the videos and participating. I think it's really weird being a member or fellow of the School's History Project and talking about the organisation, because you have a sense of how important it is. It may be to you, but not necessarily, the kind of bigger or wider importance it has. So the project came about in the early 1970s. 1971, David Sylvester was appointed as the first director, and he had two main aims, really. One was, he wanted students to know what history teaching was, what is history? And that was the question he actually asked students, and they were like, I don't know. And he said, well, they should be able to answer that question. The second thing was he wanted them to do history. And what that meant was, looking at the discipline, looking at the kinds of skills and the knowledge that they could do intellectually honest work at a particular grade level or year level that would be suited to them, but would still have historical integrity. Now, the work of the School's History Project has changed the landscape of education in England, especially in terms of historical thinking. In terms of assessments, exam courses, how we even talk, even now, 30 years, or 50, the time later, it's had a huge effect, and to the point where the effect is so massive that you can't really see it in some cases until you really look at it. And I think one of the really interesting things about the influence of the projects is how it's helped influence, challenge, and help people think about what's happening in their own particular situations. So the whole idea of scale switching and thinking about developments through time, I know that's had a huge effect on some of the work in the North Americas, in other countries as well. I know there's lots of work going on in Europe. I've done some work in Turkey, for example, around this. So it is surprising in one sense, but it shows that this very simple idea that really started with someone recording a video on a kind of old reel-to-reel cassette and then sending that around to schools, because that's how it started, has created this huge change.
So let me tell you a little bit about how I found out about it and what effect it had on work that I've been doing, the work that Sam Weinberg, I think would cite this as a pretty influential project. We also have, in the States, we've been trying to teach kids to do history. Doing history has been instead of just memorizing names and dates, and that's always been this kind of tension. But what struck me as really unique about the School's History Project was they focused extensively on surfacing what kids were doing when they were doing history. And so the student thinking became absolutely instrumental to their work. I stumbled on this somewhere in maybe in the late 70s, mid 80s, when I read an evaluation study by Dennis Shelmut of the project. And what he was doing was he was giving us not just what we were supposed to be doing to get kids to do it, but what he was doing was focusing on what kids were doing when they were doing history. And that was stunning. And in a sense, it was those tasks that he used as a researcher that was focusing on student learning that was really an assessment activity. And that had profound effect on people on this side of the Atlantic that were doing research on student thinking.
Yeah, and I mean, it's still an integral part. And as I mentioned about the influence, it's very hard to speak about history teaching in England today without starting with students' work and actually looking at the writing that they've produced and really trying to untangle the thought processes and thinking about, what historical skills are they talking about here? Have we planned this correctly? And there's a journal that we have in England called Teaching History. And it's history teachers who write about things that they're doing, but it's always based upon student work. So you will see examples of that and really wrestling with questions and ideas because historical thinking is difficult and assessing it is difficult, but really struggling and really working hard to understand what that looks like or what a good piece looks like.
So often when we have conversations like this, we often pose a couple of questions, and I think Terrence Beck in his lovely track talk, he posed two questions. One was, so what is historical thinking? And then the second is, how do we get students to do historical thinking? But I think the School's History Project and the work that we've been doing and the virtue of assessment focuses on what I would think would be a middle question, a question between the doing of historical thinking, what it is, and that how we get kids to do it. And this is a claim I want to see if you agree with. Actually, I know that you will agree with it, so I'm going to be prepared. I'm going to ask you examples. That students' existing ideas, their pre-instructional ideas, no matter when the instruction takes place, play a significant role in what they learn and what you teach. So that if you don't understand what students are thinking, you're kind of missing the boat. You're acting as if they're blank slates. So you agree with it? I'm seeing you shaking your head.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important that we understand that we really do need to understand that students come with particular ideas before they get into the classroom. It could be family histories or films that they've watched or various other things. History is basically all around them. So it's great to tap into that, but also to use that to challenge the perceptions that they may have. And that's what I think leads to one of the great things. And I think this is part of, we were trying to feel through this, or everyone was trying to feel through this in the track talks, is, about the inquiry questions and how we can get students engaged. I would use them slightly differently because, and the School's History Project would, is that the inquiry question really drives the learning and actually challenges the students and really asks them to produce a piece of work at the end, whatever that may be, as a good historical piece. There is a fair attempt at producing something which is historically valid. So in order to do that, you do need to be aware of where students are, but you also need to make sure that you've got your idea about the kinds of skills and the content that you need to get them to understand to get to that particular final point.
So one of the things that plays a significant role here is that question, as I'm sure it does in the UK, is the kinds of background knowledge that kids bring into, or learners bring into the classroom, their own theories, their own ideas. And assessment then should be surfacing those things. Can you give a couple of examples of maybe something that surprised you about your students thinking about something, whether it's a substantive idea or a historical thinking skill like causation, or use of evidence?
I think if I take causation, because that's normally the thing that we always talk about, and I find students normally think of causes as operating in a very linear way. So this happened, this happened, this happened. But as historians, we are trying to get them, and what historians do, and this is, we take apart some of the historians' actual work so they can understand that, is that, yes, there is a sequence, but there's normally a hierarchy. And there's some which are, necessary causes, and the ones that are sufficient causes, and there's also conditional ones. And that is really, it's amazing to see students go through that process. And so Arthur Chapman, who uses the story of Alphonse the camel to get students to think about this, which is, it's a whole story. I won't go into it, but it's a really good example of getting students to really think about causal reasoning. And it's amazing to see how whatever they think, when they come into the classroom and as they go through that type of activity, and then as they go through the sequence of lessons to produce a piece of work at the end, which, they couldn't produce. And it's sometimes what I do get them to do is right at the start of the sequence of lessons or the inquiry is to say, what do they think? And then compare that with what they produce at the end.
So the task then is to surface what students, what they're thinking, before you can even begin to mediate it and begin to manage it.
Yeah, I think it's a really helpful way. If you can challenge their preconceptions, that's a really good way of thinking about it. So if I give you another example, which is to do with evidence. So one of the pictures that I use when I teach Nazi Germany is of a character called Hans J. Massacre. And he is mixed heritage. His father was from Liberia, if I remember correctly. His mother was German, but he's standing there. There's a picture of him in the early 1930s. He looks, like me, but he's standing there with a swastika on his jumper. Now, all the preconceptions students have, they know that the Nazis operated on racial theories and various other things, and then they see this child standing amongst his classmates, and they go, I haven't seen this picture before. What is happening here? And so then you can pick out, what they think they think they know about the Nazi regime, and then you have an in, because then it's like, well, okay, that I didn't know this was the case, and how do we get to get them to think about that? And so, you know, that's a really good example. And some of my students' work is actually on his Wikipedia page at the moment, because I use that as a way to get them to read his autobiography, which is a pretty amazing book. So he grew up in Nazi Germany, in the Weimar Germany and then Nazi Germany, came to the US, fought in the Korean War, and got involved in the civil rights movement. I mean, it's you know, I'm waiting for the film to be produced, but it's a really interesting way to get them to think about how the Nazi regime operated, you know, within in terms of relations with different racial groups, but then the diversity within society. So they're really getting a good understanding rather than a kind of very stereotypical view that they may have from watching films.
So the trick then, or a trick then in assessment, is to create a task that allows the student to take what they're thinking, so that you can see it and you can see a range of thinking. You can't deal with the preconceptions unless you actually know what they are. I'll give you two quick examples. When I was teaching in the high school, somewhere around the late 80s, I read a piece of research that Sam Weinberg had published in a journal when he was talking about the gaps between the way historians think about evidence and the ways in which kids think about evidence. And he was saying that what his research showed, that kids were reading primary sources like they were reading the textbook. They were gutting it for factual information. They weren't contextualizing, they weren't sourcing, they weren't doing any of the heuristics that Sam named. And I read it, pretty arrogant high school teacher. I had been teaching for maybe, I don't know, 15 years or so. And I thought, he couldn't be talking about my students. We read primary sources. They give me what I want in the primary sources. So how could I possibly think about doing what Sam did to see, because I thought he was wrong. So I did a think aloud, and I asked my students to read primary sources while they were thinking out loud. And I took some of my best students, and son of a gun, if they weren't doing exactly what Sam's students were doing in his dissertation study and eventually his research studies. And then that led me then to say, yikes, is it possible that the students had learned to play the game enough to give me what I wanted, but that I hadn't really touched the ways in which they were approaching text? So that gets us into this question about, you know, so what's the task that might probe those kinds of thinking? Let's start with the question, though, that Terrence asked. So when you think about historical thinking, what are the elements or the features of it that we would construct assessment tasks around historical thinking?
So going back to what I said about inquiry questions, you know, for me, that really drives the type of historical thinking that you're assessing. So if you're looking at change, so you'd say, you know, or sorry, a cause, you'd say, you know, what caused the First World War, for example. So I know my question is at the end that I'm going to get the students to look at is looking at causes. You know, that's pretty simple. If I was, and I'm going to use a couple of examples from my colleagues in the UK. So, you know, they looked at women's suffrage, and another example would be, you know, what were the suffrage campaigners fighting for? So then you can look at diversity of or a range of different views within that. And then another thing you could look at is, you know, what's the story of the suffrage campaign? So you're looking at how narratives and how evidence is used. So, you know, it's the question helps you drive, you know, or think about that particular skill. But it doesn't necessarily mean it has to end up as a piece of writing. And I think that's the main thing. So it could be a formal essay, it could be a debate. And, you know, the example that you gave about getting the students to think aloud, I mean, that is assessing historical thinking. It's not a summative piece of assessment that, you know, you kind of put in your mark book to say they've got, you know, 10 out of 20 or something else, but you are assessing how they're getting along. You know, it could be that you're asking them to critique a particular thing. Or when I use the Wikipedia example with my students, I use Wikipedia's rubric, as well as making sure that there were some key things that I wanted to see within that. Or they could produce a radio show or podcast, but you create the rubric to say, I am clear about the particular historical skills that, you know, that and information that I'm looking for. So For me, and I think this is, one of some of the things that were in some of the track talk videos, it's important, I think, to kind of, as you say, to surface that, but also to have a very clear idea in your head about what the kind of outcome is. And for me, the question helps drive that.
So what is it that we want them to surface? So what's the type of thinking? So one would be, you pose this idea of historical questions. So would we be interested in assessing the ways in which kids can frame their own historical questions?
I mean, yeah, I mean, that would be a really good way. And I know some colleagues have done that exactly, where they've asked the students to come up, or they've taught some of the content and said, right, what's a good historical question that we could ask around this? And I can't personally say I've done that, but, I've seen some pretty amazing results. Or if you're asking to think about, diversity of opinion at a particular event, you can get them to think about that. Or why is this particular event important for a range of people, or what changed over a period of time. One of the examples that, or the things that I've used, is using EH. The 20 Years Crisis, to think about international relations between 1919 and 1939. And using Carr's idea, but then looking at the actual historical events to see if the students agree with Carr in terms of chronology, which of course normally they do, but they think about different political decisions or military decisions or social and economic factors to go along with that as well. So it's about trying surfacing that, but then making sure that you are being intentional and that you're really trying to draw out. And the only way really to do that, I think, is, as you suggested before, is using some of the assessments as you go through, because that makes you adjust what you are doing, and then thinking about the task at the end as well. And that's what makes it very difficult, I think, but also incredibly rewarding, because the students then produce work which is, it is, in terms of the school's history projects, it is historically valid. They can make an argument, they're doing intellectually honest work, and then you can build on that as they go through the different age phases. So even if they don't take history later on, they can say, well, I know how to handle or to ask questions of particular sources. If I read something, I know Sam Weinberg's done lots of work on this already. What question should I be asking? Can I tally that with something else that I've seen? Or I've heard one, I've heard one particular story, but I know there's many things that lead to an event happening. So what are the things that are missing? And just trying to get them to think about that they can take away if they're not doing history, but into their wider lives.
So one of the things that we could be doing is assessing, because historians pose questions. And when you're about to do a research project or historical project, you frame a big problem space and you frame smaller questions along the way. So that's historical thinking. We often don't assess that, but that might be a really interesting. In fact, almost without fail, at least in the United States, when we're assessing historical thinking, someone else has created the question, the assessor. So that might be one. In this country, analyzing primary sources has become almost the gold standard for assessing historical thinking. So that's the use of evidence. What else would be part of historical thinking? How important would it be to compare and contrast different narratives?
I think that's incredibly important, because then you're looking at different accounts, and then you can also see how the narrative changes through time. So, historical records, that suddenly appear because they've been lost, or different analysis techniques. There was a story about Stonehenge recently, and trying to work out where the stones actually came from. And I think there was just some work done this year, and they've just published those resources. So then that changes how we think about how the monument was created. So I think it's very important that they can compare and contrast and actually test particular stories or versions of events, and looking at the different types of particular evidence. And one of the things, as you said about using sources, and this is a problem that we have here, because we're thinking about formal exams, it's normally something that's written. And we've been doing lots of interesting work, and Trevor Getz has been helping us, in this country, think about this and looking at West Africa. And a lot of the history there is oral sources, And it's, you know, that's challenging for us to think about, but it's now becoming part of how we think about how we teach the history of West Africa before the 1600s, and using these stories and using these proverbs as sources, not as letters or accounts, but as a way of understanding what people were thinking and feeling.
So posing questions, use of evidence, analysis of different interpretations, including what would be the implications. Because often when we talk about narratives, we often will talk about, and this also feeds in the ways which many adolescents think, at least many of my students when I was teaching in the high school and here, even at the university, they often think of the world as an on-off switch. Either something is true or it's false, someone was good or evil, it was awesome or it sucked, as they say. And so trying to figure out what beyond the on-off switch, but what are the implications of holding one interpretation over another? What does it cause us to see? That's historical thinking as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I would say it's not necessarily, something that we necessarily assess for, but it really does help with the causation piece, which is talking about the, you know, how things are caused, but then also the consequences, that is using counterfactuals.
Right.
So, you know, as a way of really testing. So if we take this out, what might happen? And, you know, I know we agree on this as well, is using that as a way to kind of predict and say, okay, we're at this point, what do you think might happen? And to get them to kind of reason in that way, and then actually go through the events. And it, you know, it does give them a different way of thinking about the past, because it is difficult. It is different to what they normally do, and especially, you know, in the UK, we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of years ago in terms of the history that we teach. And it's very hard to get the students to think about what life was like in the 1500s when they're faced with the closing of the monasteries, because it's entirely different to the experience that they have. But, you know, if you can find a way to, you know, to get them there, and empathy is obviously another aspect, even though that's problematic in terms of the language that we use here in the UK. But that's you know, there's a really good way of getting them to understand, you know, why do people think this? And this is where cultural history is really good, to use some of the information that people have produced, or the accounts, and if we have them, to understand what people were thinking and feeling at the time. So looking at the consequences, absolutely, and, you know, and then possibly thinking about, you know, well, what's going to happen much later on, and you may not actually deal with it at that particular time, but then you can go back, you know, maybe months, even a year later, and just bring up the question, say, right, do you remember when we did this, you know, 6 months ago? And they might go, well, okay, and you just remind them and said, right, okay, so we're looking at this particular period now, and, you know, how are these two things interconnected, or how are they not interconnected?
So,
and then they're back into that kind of way of thinking again.
So as a community, and here I'm talking about this kind of, you know, community of history teachers, not just to think like a historian, but how do we think like a history teacher? And it seems to me that having a map of historical thinking, problems, use of evidence, determining significance, different types of narratives, the production of narrative, the intellectual etiquette that allow us to evaluate other people's narratives and looking for implications, would allow us to then kind of survey the whole field. And then what we would need would be examples of assessments that would be doing each of these things. Now, I know in your track talk, you did a really lovely thing about posing questions. We touched a little bit on it, but you also did something that was pleasantly surprising. And that was you talked about the virtue of multiple choice tests. You know, I work in a school of ed, and often my students, when they are now about to go out and start to teach, they'll often tell me there are three things that they learned. One is, don't use a textbook. I'm not sure where they learned it. I think they learned it from textbooks. Don't lecture. They must have learned it in a lecture. And don't use multiple choice tests. That these are all bad things. They're not. But you talked about an interesting way that you're using multiple choice tests. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it really, and I know multiple choice questions are, kind of, as you mentioned before, a staple of history teaching and assessment in the US. They don't form part of our historical assessments at all, in terms of
At
formal
all?
exams. And no,
Not in
not at all.
tests at all?
No, they just don't exist. So it's really interesting for us to think about how they may be used. And really, because people think about multiple choice questions as, you're just ticking off a list and you're just fact checking. What I wanted to do was to try and think about how I could use this. And this is really based on some of the work from cognitive psychology about, putting things in long-term memory. And really giving them the knowledge so they can actually work with the historical ideas. So, Pete LaPrey talks about playing the whole game. It's not just the little drops of information. I want them to have that and be able to play with it a little bit. So the multiple choice questions were there, and they were low stakes. So I just kept a record of them, didn't go on any reports at all. And it was based on the work that we've done over, a few weeks. And it just meant that the students, I put the questions up, the students then, wrote down their answers, whatever else, and then I just went through them at the end, and then we just carried on with the lesson. And what was really interesting is that after a series of weeks, you could see students who are now getting really involved and they knew really difficult concepts. So Caesaropapism, for example, is not normally something that I would teach to my 17 and 18-year-old students, which is basically, the king, the monarch, is in charge of the country and the church, but that's not a concept that you would teach to grade 7 students.
Wait, hold on a second. Hold on a second here, Nick. So you're telling me that you're giving quizzes so your kids learn factual information?
Yeah,
it's heretical. Yes. You're a heretic.
Well, I hope not, but the point is it wasn't so much I was interested in the scores in terms of retaining the information, it was the practice. And so they became very familiar with that. And what was pretty amazing was the assessments that the students actually wrote, and it was an actual question. And I gave the example in the video. You could see, and I analyzed their work, and I had one class who did the tests and one class that didn't.
Yeah, talk a little bit about the empirical study that you did in your own classroom.
Yeah, so I mean, the multiple choice questions were there to kind of really get them going over the period of weeks. But what I really was interested in was the end result, as I said, thinking about the inquiry question and doing something at the end. And what you could see then was, they were using bits of information. So using dates, using key terms and explaining it, using bits of evidence that they could link, and particular names, and given explanations that were, I would expect, a really good student in grade 7 or even someone in grade 8 or grade 9 to produce. But the quizzes weren't the main thing. They were there to support the actual final assessed piece of work, which is I was getting them to think about causes, essentially. So that the multiple choice questions were there as a formative assessment. They're helping the students where they were going. And it also gave me some information, because if I could see, as I was looking at the class answers, that it was clear that the majority of the class hadn't understood something, that meant that I went and adjusted my teaching so they could understand that. So it was allowed me to be responsive rather than the score itself.
So often when we talk about assessing historical thinking, we ignore the fact that content matters as well. And having fluency with content knowledge enables us to do things, to think about things in ways that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do. That there's often a false dichotomy between teaching thinking and teaching factual information. And what you found was, by doing the formative assessments around these quizzes, low stakes, kids had a greater familiarity and were able to do more things than kids that didn't. Now, there's another way. Go ahead.
No, I mean, it's interesting. The one thing I would say is with what I found in my studies, but also in terms of the research study from the psychologists, is how long that information is retained for. So it seems to be good for a few weeks. If we're talking about a whole semester, a whole term, or a whole year, you may need to use the quizzes in different ways, even if you're teaching other topics, to help them remember that.
Well, some work that I did years ago in Long Beach, we did very similar things. And then we had students producing essays like you did. These were about evaluating effective leadership in the United States in a US history course. And the combination of the quizzes and then the use of that information in making an argument gave it a much longer shelf life. Kids actually retained it much, much longer. And so now there's one of the track talks had another way to use multiple choice quizzes in a formative way. And that was the one by Kim Elliott and Leah Marquez. And if we could just show a little bit of a clip of that, and then we can talk about it at the other end. So roll the clip.
Let's look at this question from our practice set on Reconstruction. When creating questions, we want wrong answers to be wrong, but also compelling enough so that students who don't know the right answer might feasibly pick them. We can't help kids diagnose what they don't know if the correct answer is so obvious that they don't even have to look at the other options. In this question, we're asking students to first, understand the author's argument in the excerpt. Second, know the legislation passed during the Civil War. And third, connect the author's argument to a piece of legislation that addressed his concerns.
That's a lot to do in one question, which means that there are a lot of places where students can trip up. If they misunderstand the author's argument, they might think that Lawrence is talking about freeing African-American people from slavery and choose the Emancipation Proclamation. If they understand that the author is talking about citizenship, but they don't know the Reconstruction Amendments well enough, they might pick the 13th Amendment when what they really mean is the 14th Amendment. Or if they don't know the context of the Civil War and their chronological reasoning is off, they might pick the Freedmen's Bureau, not knowing the Freedmen's Bureau predates the speech. So distractors, more than anything, are not only meant to fill out a multiple choice question, but to send a signal to teachers and students about the misconceptions a student has.
So I love that piece because what it does is I could look to see what misconceptions my students have by the way they answered that question.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I think I have to say, when I looked at those AP questions and not actually studying that topic, I thought there is no way I could even have a chance of answering them. But I loved how the intentionality about thinking very carefully about the distractors and making sure it's something which, if they're not chronologically sure, they might go for that as well. And I think that's where that's really good. It's very hard to design questions like that take time. But, if you do it with your colleagues, that might make it easier. Sorry.
Well, by the way, that's one of the things that I'm going to want us to move towards at the end of this, which is, we could use as a community really good assessments. And often what we do is we construct them in our own environment, or we allow someone else to do it. And then we don't ever publish on it. We don't ever talk about it. In this pandemic, imagine if people who are designing good tests for COVID-19 just never shared them. So we could actually use that. But what struck me about that is once I understand what the distractors are, then there are kids' misconceptions that would be quite common. And I could change the prompt to get at, so that a different distractor could be the correct answer, which would then surface the ways in which kids think. That is really powerful stuff about using the assessment as a diagnostic tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having the analysis behind some of the work that the Khan Academy is doing, is so helpful. It also means that, if you can clearly see there's a number of the class haven't got something, then that allows you to adjust your teaching and be responsive, and think about what you're teaching them next year, or you're teaching a similar topic, to get them to focus on that particular area. But it's incredibly powerful as a way of, as a piece of formative assessment before they get to the final thing, as they were using it, as a way of just surfacing that and challenging and making sure that they are thinking historically.
So now, if we think about, so there's the multiple choice example, and that one strikes me as really, really rich and robust, and one that we could share, that I could use and say, like if I name, 4 tax rebellions, Bacon's Rebellion, Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, et cetera, in US history, and then have a different prompt, then I would be getting at kids contextualizing those events, understanding what causes are, and it just surfaces their understanding, which would cause me then to analyze the results of the test rather than just the test itself. By the way, that's another thing I think that we could use. I mean, imagine, I'll go back to the medical model. Imagine a doctor who gives a test, but then never reports the results of the test, right? To know exactly what the range would be. So if you gave a test to your students, I'd want to know the range of how your students responded. That would help me in looking at my own students.
Absolutely. Sorry, I just want to say
no, go ahead.
Dylan William, who is an academic who focuses on assessment, he talks about hinge questions. So these could be multiple choice questions where the distractors, and you can use them halfway through the lesson or partway through the lesson. So it doesn't actually have to be a formal test, as a way of surfacing and seeing, if you're teaching content, say, let me just check to see everyone's on the same page here. And then, if they're not, then you can say, okay, let's go back, because especially if you're teaching something which is, they really need to know the next kind of hierarchical part of it, then you will need to go back and change that. But that's another good way.
But there's all kinds of other tools like that. So the multiple choice, because they're so anathema to so many teachers, though we use them, we rely on them, and we often just use them out of the test bank. So the intentional design of those things are really critical.
Yeah.
But there's other things, graphic organizers, for example. Have you ever used those to assess your student thinking?
Yeah. So if I go back in one sense to refer to Arthur Chapman's work, he talks about using diamond nines, which is basically bits of paper cut up into a diamond. Yeah, it's 9 little things like this, and you can get them to move causes around in or different interpretations in a hierarchy, and get them to actually try and explain. Because if they just think, well, I'm just giving some information here, and you're like, well, that doesn't really make sense. Why is that one more important than this? And that's a really good way of forcing them to play around with the ideas. But they, if they can move it around as well in front of them, so they can change it, then that's great. So yeah, graphic organizers certainly would be another good way to help them surface their thinking.
We've used card sorts. So we'll often give a series of causes to students, and then ask them to sort the on their desk, draw some arrows and lines, and that shows the relationships in dynamic ways, and is often a really good pre-writing strategy, an easy way to assess causation or consequential thinking. What about empathy? Historical empathy. How is it, our tendency is to, and boy, in my country right now, we're going through a whole big issue about trying to evaluate historical figures in their own time without forgiving them for unethical things. How do you assess historical empathy?
That's a very interesting question. Historically, I can say I'm giving a typical historian's answer now, because it has been problematic in England for a whole variety of reasons, and it's one of the things that I think I can say that we don't do very well. And as you mentioned, the current situation has basically forced us to think a bit more about this in a way that really does justice to the idea. So, this is where talking about cultural histories and trying to understand what people were thinking and feeling at a particular time, rather than just looking at the kind of official documentation, is really important. So it is one of the, in terms of thinking about how that's assessed, it's one of the things that we don't do very well here. It is something that people normally think about in terms of making sure students care about particular topics. And I noticed that really from the track talks, there is a I suppose even a greater need to talk about the kind of relevance, the engagements, than it is here. And so I think there's a slight difference, because the argument that we try and push here is that the history is good in itself. So yes, there is some relevance, but it's really pushing that idea.
I'll give you something that I did while I was teaching high school. I do something similar to it at the university. I will often ask students to conjecture about something in their own lives. When I taught the bubonic plague, before, my gosh, I could have invented COVID-19, but I would ask my students, imagine you face this pandemic. How do you think people would respond? Would they blame other people? What would you expect from the government, et cetera, et cetera? Or when I taught the Crusades, imagine someone said, I was teaching in Cleveland, Ohio, you've got to walk across the country to Los Angeles to save Los Angeles from invasion. Would you do it? What would you do it for? And once they've bracketed the present, then you have something to compare it to. So then when you're studying the past, you can say, what was similar or different from the ways in which they were thinking. So my students, for example, they used to say that they would, they would march to Los Angeles for money. So we would quibble about how much money. And then they found out that none of them would do it for religion, so they said. But then they found out the religious spirit, but then they also saw, second sons who wouldn't inherit for primogeniture, essentially shared that pretty much in common. Pre-tests are really important in order to see a student growth. Because I've been working on narrative now for the last 10 or 15 years, I start my courses at the university by asking my students to write a history of the topic we're studying. So I'm teaching essentially a global history course, and I ask them to write a history of the world in 15 minutes. And I collect it. And then at the end of the course, I give it back and ask them to correct it. And then what you can see is the growth over time, because they're doing the very best job that they could possibly. One of the things, I'm sorry, go ahead, Nick.
No, I was about to say, no, that's amazing to do that.
One of the things that we've been focusing on, and which is this discrimination, this zeroing in on a particular skill or a particular substantive idea. And that raises this question about the whole versus the part. The assessing whether a student can analyze a DBQ evidence does not mean they can do history. It means they can do one little piece of it. In one of the track talks, Pete LaPrey gave a really lovely example of it using the example of coaching softball. So I'm going to say it again. Let's roll that clip.
They really did not have a basic understanding of the game. So we worked on the fundamentals, right? Just throwing, breaking down the elements of the swing, knowing what base to throw to. We worked on all of the individual elements. And then came the game situation. I don't remember exactly what the score was. I thought about looking it up for this talk, but I don't know if I want to relive that memory. But we got blown out, mercy ruled in the first 4 innings. We had girls who didn't know what base to throw. We had, over the course of the career, we've had a couple of students who ran the bases in the wrong direction. I bring this up because what we did was to teach the elements. It should have been enough, but when it came time to put it all together, they struggled. My fear is that that is what we're doing when we teach and assess historical thinking.
Yeah, so that's a real good caution, isn't it?
Yeah,
so how do you
absolutely.
respond?
Oh, well, I mean, I think, and Pete hit it on the head where, he was saying that, we teach, there is the elementitis that we're focusing on particular component parts. They are useful, I think, in terms of us planning, but you've got to have that larger picture in your head. So as I mentioned before, this is where inquiry questions are really good, because they help you think about the different elements that you're thinking about, over a sequence of lessons, but then also what the end result is. So, even though you may be going into, depth about causes of something, it kind of pulls you back, because actually that's not the question you're answering. You're not just focusing on the skill, you're using the skill to answer the genuine historical question. So it is difficult, and especially if you get on a hobby horse that you have, that you feel particularly passionate about, or you really want to communicate this to the students, and you go too far down that track, it can cause problems. But I think this is where the discernment, the skills of the teacher in holding, what does the game look like, so to speak, and how those pieces are contribute to that. So
yeah, I mean, that may come back to what we were talking about before, about what's the map, what's a cognitive map of the discipline. What is it about in the OER projects, we use this kind of triangular map of framing problems, use of evidence, producing knowledge, informal note-taking, things like that. And so if you've got a map of what the discipline is about, in a sense, the way the rules of the game are played, and then you could focus on one, but what you're doing is always showing it in context. I think that might be the answer to what Pete was talking about, because I think he identified a really critical problem. Now, something that's really big in this country is in fact, I'm sure it's true everywhere, but it was a theme that ran through a number of the track talks, and that's about authentic assessment. And so the authentic assessment is referring to the task that people would do in their daily lives, that it has a relevance to this moment. Boy, that's tough for history, isn't it? Or is it?
I mean, I think there's certain topics that you can link to the present moment in whatever you're looking at, but I also think it allows you, one of the dangers I think with doing that all the time, and I teach politics as well as history, and it's very easy for me to do that because I'm talking about events that are happening now. But one of the dangers is you're concentrating on the present, and the people in the past that had, depending on how long you're going back, different ideas, different ways of looking at the world, and different understandings. And one of the things that obviously we've been talking about a lot across the world is the notion of racism and race, and and how that as a historical idea has changed over a period of time. So it's useful, I think, in terms of giving a particular meaning in the present, if you can, but not to kind of focus on it too much, so it's to the detriment of the real kind of historical understanding that students will need. I mean, I do find it really interesting because we don't have the term authentic assessments in the UK around that, even though that people talk about project-based learning and things with real-world outcomes. But an assessed piece of work, in my view, is something that has integrity. And that's really the key thing that I think you want students to take out into whatever they're doing, be it historical or English, or even just talking to people, that they do it with integrity.
I mean, part of it might also be that you not only take a historical problem in the past, but take a contemporary problem and then analyze it historically. Look at the different interpretations of it. Where do you begin the story of this moment? Because that makes a big difference. If I begin the American story in 1980, that changes if I look at it from 1945 or even earlier, around the sets of things. We only have a couple more minutes, and one of the, I've been paying attention to the questions and working them in that have been coming from the discussions. And one of the questions was about the disparity in an online environment, and the disparity in technology that people have. And actually, there's a second part to that question. I just don't think that we can answer that question other than to say it is horrible, and at least states and governments need to do something about that. But there is a second part to that question. And as you think about the distance learning, are there any new assessments that you think you might trial now that your students won't be doing paper and pencil questions? So
I mentioned that, for example, podcasts or people recording, a historical argument as a way of thinking about producing a piece of work. So that could be quite relatively short, so you're not expecting to give a lecture or something. I think there are really good tools for assessing historical thinking. A variety of online tools that are free that you could do quizzes on. There's lots of things with really nice algorithms that you can put stuff in, and so you can help the students remind themselves about where they are. So there are a variety of things, but I think it's one of the things that I always worry about is that we're talking now about assessment as being very separate from the kind of history that we're looking at, and to kind of go back to the question, it would be, right, what are we looking at here? What's the intellectually honest question we want them to answer? And then we can think about an assessment piece that would really help with that. So it could be podcasts, it could be a debate that you could have online if you're using kind of online tools, but you would then need to be very clear about what the purpose of that debate is, and the student should have that rubric beforehand as well.
The last time, historians, we have archives of historical work. They're called libraries, there are journals, and we don't really have as rich an archive of teaching, good assessments, and then how the students responded that I can build upon and use. And so maybe that's something that that will come out of this conference, is a good archive on that. With that, Nick, I'm going to have to turn this back over to Maheen. Again, it's always a joy to talk with you. And so back to you, Maheen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob and Nick. Such useful insights and thoughtful conversation on the how and the why of assessing historical thinking. To me, it's so clear that, from your conversation, thoughtful and intentional assessment helps us become more responsive to students' needs and therefore better educators. So we really appreciate both of you taking the time to talk to us about this.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
So in about 30 minutes at 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, we hope you'll join us for another great live discussion, this one on knowledge building and literacy. Historical thinking skills and language skills go hand in hand, and you won't want to miss this other, on top of all the ones we already had today, live discussion. We'll see you very soon.